Before I go any further, John, I hope you'll forgive me for this. You know, John is a man who always carries himself professionally. He's never without a tie when he's at work. But that tie is always loosened and the collar is unbuttoned. So I ask anyone in the room wearing a tie to loosen the tie and unbutton the collar in homage to John Scarano. Now, counter to legend, John did not go fishing with his father on the day of his baptism. But it wasn't long before fishing became a passion of his, and one that is, in many ways, emblematic of his vocation over many decades. John Scarano, rooted deeply in his Catholic faith, has been patiently dropping lures that attract people to a life of deeper meaning and commitment for decades. John's witnessed enormous changes in the world and in the church. When he was born, indeed when I was born, the church still held that, quote, error had no rights, unquote. And that a fruitful and fraternal, and it was a time when a fruitful and fraternal dialogue between Christians and other denominations, let alone Jews or Muslims, was almost inconceivable or unheard of. He came of age in the heady decades of the church's life after the Second Vatican Council, which concluded in 1965. So when he graduated from college at Franklin and Marshall in 1980 and immediately set out for South Bend, where he did a master's degree in theology at the University of Notre Dame, his parents must have thought he'd gone crazy. All right? In other words, what is this idea of lay ministry? From there, he went on to Florida, where he worked progressively in a series of ministry posts in the Archdiocese of Miami, including that of director of the Catholic Student Center at the University of Miami. In fact, one little-known aspect of John's career in Miami was that when he served as a spiritual director of some sort for the then football coach Jimmy Johnson and the Hurricane football team. One can only imagine how things would have turned out if John had been there. John's career progressed as he took on directorships in campus ministry at Ursuline College and for the Diocese of Belleville, Illinois, where he was the director of campus ministry for Southern Illinois University. Thus, when he arrived on our campus in 2003, John was already a seasoned national leader in campus ministry. We have been the beneficiaries of his experience, his faith, and his professionalism. He is an example of lay ministry since the Second Vatican Council and of efforts to renew and innovate ministry to young adults. The significance of this should not be overlooked. And this is why I, as a historian, want to frame what John's going to share with us this way. Prior to the Second Vatican Council, the role of the laity in the church was far more restricted than it is today. Indeed, the idea of a lay minister would have seemed rather foreign to many Catholics who saw the church as something that functioned according to the work of clergy and members of religious orders. But the Second Vatican Council initiated an enormous change in this outlook. In its decree Lumen Gentium, the church clearly identified the apostolate of the laity as an integral part of the church, saying, among other things, quote, the laity are gathered together in the people of God and make up the body of Christ. That's a kind of horizontalist view, an inclusive view of the laity that wouldn't have existed before. And further, it says the lay apostolate is a participation in the salvific mission of the church itself. Through their baptism and confirmation, all are commissioned to that apostolate by the Lord himself. So John's work is now recognized as essential, as is the work of other lay ministries. This council then, therefore, opened doors that didn't exist before for people like John. The second point I would like to make regards campus ministry itself. It's often forgotten that there was a time on the campuses of Catholic colleges and universities when campus ministry basically did not exist. And that may surprise you. But think about it. When there were scores of priests on a campus such as our own, ministry to students was seen as the work of any of the priests. Perhaps there was a prefect of the chapel, but that was about it. It was only in the 1970s that campus ministry was actually organized on Jesuit campuses. In fact, here at John Carroll, it was Father Joe Schell in 1970. And in fact, the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities Conference on Campus Ministry didn't start to meet informally until the 1970s, and its bylaws weren't established until 1989. My point is that when John started out, this was all very new. In the life and career of John Scarano, we see one who has been both a pioneer of and a witness to the emergence of lay ministry in the church and campus ministry. His reflections today can be seen as a kind of documentation of and testimony to the emergence of the church as a community of those who choose to serve where there is a place for all. So not only is it a pleasure to offer a forum to a revered colleague who has been a friend and a mentor to many in this room, it is important to recognize the work of John and others like him who have sought to create a new way of being church that we now see being further articulated by Pope Francis and the synodal way of living. Giovanni, carissimo, eminenza, it is an honor and a privilege to learn from you today. Please welcome our brother, John Scarano.
The reason that my tie is loosened and my button is not buttoned is that I cannot button that collar, nor have I ever been able to. Don Cousins used to say I have no neck. So this might be the last time I'm able to use this opening line at John Carroll, and this is for you, Matt. For those of you in the back, I am standing. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I got into campus ministry, or how I got into campus ministry. And I have to start that with coming out of an Italian Catholic family. And my mother especially was very Catholic. When I was born, I was baptized in the operating room the moment in which I was born. And on my baptismal certificate, it actually has my birthday as the day of my baptism. 6 months later, we did it again in a church. I don't remember, but that was a renewal of my baptism, because you can only be baptized once, right, in the Catholic Church. So my mother was deathly afraid of what was called limbo, so I was okay. My mother was the one who instilled a Catholic faith in us. My early memories consist mostly of her praying the rosary in a church pew, in a kitchen chair, in a lawn chair as she watched us in the backyard. I knew more about St. Anthony and St. Jude by the time I was 5 years old than I did about any of our neighbors. When I was young, my family moved to Italy, and it was not uncommon for my grandmother, my aunts, my mother, all to walk the mile to the little Catholic church in our village to go to Mass on weekdays. And on weekends, that was a special occasion when everybody would make the walk. My grandfather, my uncles, my father, all the men, along with the women, would walk the mile to the Catholic church in town. And as you walk into this church, which is on kind of a square, all the men would veer to the right and sit out in this outdoor cafe, and all the women and children would go into the church. At the end of Mass, usually, in this country, a priest would stand at the back door and shake everybody's hand. But the priest walked out in the procession, and he walked right over to the little cafe and sat down and had a nice glass of vino with all his friends, fully vested. So it was quite a sight to see. I soon longed for the days when I could grow up and be a man and veer off into the cafe. When we moved back to the States, we eventually settled in a small town in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. And I went to St. Jude's Catholic Church, which was the only church in Mountaintop, Pennsylvania. And the priest and the nun, who I really liked, who were in charge of our confirmation, ran away together and got married. I guess they liked each other too. I don't know. But I thought to myself, as a kid, how could such a scandalous thing happen in 1969? That quickly changed for me into how can that not happen? My understanding of Catholicism was of these days. Let me tell you just a word about the house I grew up in. When you walked into our front door, there was a semicircular stairway that led upstairs. When you walked into our front door, there was a near life-size crucified Jesus on the wall. As you walked up the staircase, when you reached the top, there was a little alcove with a statue of Mary and a pull-out kneeler with all of our holy cards, pictures of every dead relative I think my mother could find. For a high school kid, I really was in touch with my sinfulness as I walked into my house every day. It was tough. I didn't want to invite anybody to the house because of that. So my mother and I used to fight every Sunday morning about having to go to Mass. Eventually, she got tired of fighting. For the most part, I felt that there was nothing about church that made me want to go, and I was going to grow up and be like my dad. Church was for women. They didn't really need it. So off I went to college, Franklin and Marshall College, where we were the diplomats. Can you imagine? We called ourselves the Dips, the F&M Dips. Our stadium was the Diplodome. It goes on from there. But in my first year of college, my first semester in college, I was invited to go to a Bible study. And it was a very attractive young woman. Chris, close your ears. It was a very attractive young woman, so I said, of course I'll come to Bible study. And when I got into the room where they were doing Bible study, there were several other fairly attractive young women, and all greeting me and making me feel like I was 6 feet tall and skinny. It's kind of cool. I could study the Bible with these folks. I could study the telephone book with these folks. Everything was going well until one of them just happened to say, well, Catholics can't be saved. Now, I hadn't been to church in a long time. And I don't know why I reacted the way I reacted, but I got up and I walked away. I walked out of the room. This was going to be the way things would go for a while. Every time I saw any of these Bible study folks, they went out of their way to be nice to me. If we were near the student center, they would buy me a cup of coffee. That's the way to get to my heart. I finally gave in late in the spring semester of my sophomore year, and they won me over with kindness. And this time it seemed to stick. So in my junior and senior year of college, I became kind of a Bible study geek. Eventually, I led a group and was part of their executive council, and I did a bit of church hopping. Now, hold on to your seats for a moment. I joined several different congregations in my last 2 years and was baptized several more times in my life. So, at first, I was baptized in a lake by the pastor of the Lord's House of Prayer. We used to meet on the second floor of a barn. Then I was baptized in a swimming pool by Pastor Wood of the Conservative Baptist of America congregation. You hardly see any of those churches around anymore. And then in a river, it was kind of more of a creek, by one of the elders of the Fellowship, which is another non-denominational church. And last, by the pastor of the Free Will Methodist Church on a little pool on the altar. So all told, I have 6 baptisms. If I don't make it, you don't have a prayer. I'm just telling you that right now. I guess you could say I was on a bit of a journey. And each time I left one of the churches, it was because of an anti-Catholic statement that was made from the front, from the pastor. I still didn't quite have a handle on why it bothered me so much, but I couldn't stay affiliated with that church. So in my senior year, I took a class on utopian religious movements. I had the opportunity to stay with the Unification Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That was, we know them as the Moonies, Reverend Moon's congregation. So I was with them in Harrisburg, and then I spent a little bit of time with the Hare Krishna Temple in Philadelphia. And then in January, I lived with the Shakers for a month in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. There was something about the idea of a group completely leaving this world because of their spirituality, because of something that drew them, something that just made them say, there's something more to life than this. I was drawn to that. I was intrigued by it. It was powerful. Throughout this time, I was meeting with one of my college professors, who was a United Church of Christ minister, Bob Mickey, and I was applying to some non-Catholic seminaries. This was my senior year. I knew I was called, but again, I hadn't been involved in anything Catholic for a very long time. He urged me at that point in my life to understand more about the church I was leaving before I left it, the church of my parents. And he gave me this humongous double-volume set called Catholicism by Richard McBrien. And I gave in. I finally listened to him, and I applied and was accepted to the University of Notre Dame to get a master's in theology. I ended up studying with Richard McBrien, and I was actually part of the graduate student committee with him. And an amazing author, an amazingly intellectual guy, but not personable at all. So it was hard to kind of get to know him. In any case, I felt like I didn't go to Mass the entire time I was an undergrad at Franklin and Marshall. And I wanted to see what the church of my mother was about. So I went to Notre Dame. It was Catholic Disney World. It still is today. And just the idea of getting involved, I felt like I was home. Now, it was not my mother's Catholic church in these days, folks. It was, I remember one particular Mass that we met in the basement of one of the buildings, and we had saltines and Mogan David wine, and that was the Eucharist. You don't see that much anymore. When I worked in St. Joseph's Hall, which is right next to the seminary, and part of my assistantship was I helped the rector in that hall, who was Richard Zhang, was his name. He was a Holy Cross priest. And every day I went to Mass. I mean, I was fully immersed, folks. Every day I went to Mass, and most days it was just he and I, just the two of us, sitting at Mass, standing. We were both standing. I had to learn the Mass because I was the only one that was giving the responses. And we would together be watching MASH on TV, and he'd look up at me and he goes, "You want to have Mass right after MASH?" I said, "Sure, let's just do that." So we decided together when we would have Mass. In any case, the day I took my master's comps, I interviewed for a position as a youth minister in Miami, Florida. I didn't know what a youth minister was, folks, I'll be honest with you. But they flew me down and they offered me the job, and get this, they offered me $12,000 a year to be a youth minister. I was in pig heaven. $1,000 a month to do something that I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't even know that occupation existed. So I went down to Miami, and I immediately went down and joined an ecumenical group of youth ministers. I was the only Catholic there. We were all assigned prayer partners, and the one prayer partner I had was just got a job as a youth minister at Key Biscayne Presbyterian Church. And just before he got that job, he was a model for Marlboro and Hanes underwear. And he tells the story of going across the Rickenbacker Causeway, which is the bridge leading out to Key Biscayne, and there was his billboard, an Hanes underwear commercial right there, just before he got to his church. So every single kid that went to his youth group knew he was a Hanes model. But he gave me a book called Called to Care, and it really explained a lot to me about ministry, because the premise of the book by Doug Stevens is simply all of us called to ministry are first called to care. And if we care, then we can embark on this vocation that we had. So basically, Alan Gore hadn't invented the internet yet, so I had to read everything I could get a hold of in terms of youth ministry, because I didn't know what I was doing. So we had this group, and I had all the magazines, okay? And that's how I developed my sense of youth ministry. The first thing I started, the very first week, I started at St. Louis Catholic Church as the youth minister. All these kids were coming into the office and introducing themselves to me. They would get they'd put money in the soda machine, they'd get a soda, and they'd walk away. The end of the first week, one young kid, courageous, came and talked to me, and he goes, I have to say that before you came, we loaded the soda machine with beer, and that's why everybody was coming in and greeting you. That's life. That was my eyes were opened, and that's that's the youth group that I ran. My first charge from the pastor was to take these group of students who were going to be confirmed, and they fell through the cracks. So these were all seniors in high school, and if this was our last chance. And so their parents made them come, and we all sat on the floor in my office. This was when I could sit on the floor. We sat on the floor in my office in Miami, Florida, and in those days, this is 1981, and all the values clarification exercises. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they were what was in vogue. And so I took this. It wasn't paper, it wasn't styrofoam, it was some kind of bizarre styrene or whatever, this cup. And I said, let's start by, this cup represents your relationship with the church. So I'm going to pass the cup around the circle, and without speaking, I want you to indicate your relationship with the church. I said, there's only really two rules. The first rule is you have to pass it when you're done. And the second one is no killer looks. Total silence, right? So I was, pretty much full of myself at that point, and I said, this is a really great thing. I'm going to show these young people. I handed the cup off to the first person in the circle who got up, put the cup down, and stomped on it. No problem. Handed the cup to the second person who took the cup and started ripping it into pieces. Handed it to the next person who ripped it into even smaller pieces. At that point, I was rethinking my vocation. The next person in line was sitting with his back up against the door, and he kind of propped open the door, put the pieces on the pavement, reached in his pocket, got a lighter, and lit it. There were still other people to pass it to. So he scooped up the ashes, and the next guy in line was this really, really big guy. He was probably around 6'5", well into the 250 range. And he took a look at the soot in his hand, and he looked at everybody, and he spit in his hand. Now, there was still one person to hand it to. It was the only girl in the group. She was small. She was a petite little thing that was, had spiky hair and one of those fringe, things that were really popular back then. And she just stuck out her hand. She did this. And so he scraped it into her hand. She looked down on it, and then she did something with her hand, and then she reached her hand out, and she had traced a cross in the middle of it. And at that point, I said, I can do this. I can do this thing. Because in all of what was going on inside that circle, there was hope. There was the cross. So I was grateful to her. And of course, at that point, there wasn't a dry eye in the circle. When I was in my first year of youth ministry, I went to a lot of conferences because I needed to learn. So one of my first conferences was in Dallas, Texas. It was a youth ministry conference. I was probably, if not the only Catholic there, none of the others outed themselves, okay? And so the person who was speaking was a guy named Tony Campolo. He was really the only Italian Baptist I have ever come across in my life. But he was speaking. He told a bunch of great stories. And one of the stories I just want to tell you because I think it's significant. He just completed a PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. And he was teaching at Eastern Baptist Theological College in Philadelphia. And he in his dissertation he interviewed 50 people over the age of 95 Now, he had to find 50 lucid people over the age of 95. And he asked them the question, if you had to do it over again, what would you do differently? And he synthesized the top 3 answers. And the top 3 answers were, I would reflect more, I would risk more, and I would do more things that live on after I did. Pretty good advice. Reflect more, risk more, and do more things that lived on. And so I began to think what it means to reflect more. Anybody ever see the play Our Town? It's a great play. Long story short, Emily, who dies at I think 19 or 20, something very young, giving birth to her first child, is given the opportunity to live one day of her life over again. So she said, well, what was my best day? She said, it was my 12th birthday party. So she decides to live her 12th birthday party over again. So the play is her 12th birthday party and her standing over here kind of as a spirit, looking at herself, celebrating her 12th birthday. And she starts getting annoyed at herself because she's saying, here I am, this is the best day of my life, and, you don't even know it. You don't know what's happening. So she gets more and more annoyed, and finally she yells, this is in the play, she yells at her 12-year-old self, who can't hear, don't you understand that this is the best day of your life? You'll never have this moment again. And then she turns up to the audience and she says, do any of you really know what it means to live life? And it's not that the 12-year-old didn't have fun on her 12th birthday party. It's that they don't take the moment to reflect because they don't know how to do that yet. Now, as a youth minister and later a campus minister, I've probably done hundreds of retreats. Inevitably, on Saturday night when you're sitting around the campfire on a retreat, you're having the best time of your life. You're crying on the shoulder of the person next to you. I had a pastor who used to rate his homilies by the tissue quotient. Okay, so you're sitting with these people and you're having the best time of your life, and then of course in high school they pass each other in the hall on Monday, and they don't even say hello. They just cried on their shoulder Saturday night. Now, is it that nothing important happened on Saturday night, or Saturday night was somehow fake? I don't believe any of that. I think they simply didn't take the time to reflect on the moment that transpired. And so I love the fact that Ignatian spirituality talks about reflection and how reflection is what gives something meaning. So the second thing was risk more. Every new thing we do is a risk. Taking a step out in faith is a risk. There's a great quote from one of my favorites, Irma Bombeck. Do you guys know who Irma Bombeck is? She's a comedian. She's a philosopher. I found this in the mid-'80s in a law journal of all places. Okay, this is what she says. She says, "If I had my life to live over again, I would have waxed less and listened more. I would never have insisted the car windows be rolled up on a summer day because my hair had just been teased and sprayed. I would have invited friends over to dinner even if the carpet was stained and the sofa faded. I would have eaten popcorn in the good living room and worried less about the dirt when you lit the fireplace. I would have taken time to listen to my grandfather ramble on about his youth. I would have burnt the pink candle sculptured like a rose before it melted, being stored in the closet. I would have sat cross-legged on the lawn with my children and never worried about the grass stains. This is my favorite, I would have eaten less cottage cheese and more ice cream. Okay? I would have gone to bed when I was sick instead of pretending the earth would go into a holding pattern if I wasn't there for a day. And I would never have bought anything just because it was practical, wouldn't show soil, and was guaranteed to last a lifetime. There would have been many more I love yous, more I'm sorries, more I'm listenings. But most of all, given another shot at life, I would seize every minute of it, look at it, really see it, try it on, live it, exhaust it, and never give the minute back until there was nothing left." And the last piece is I would do more things that live on after I did. So this is a story about, it's a true story, actually, about a teacher, a fifth grade teacher in Buffalo, New York, named Miss Thompson. Miss Thompson she was good, she was young, she was conscientious, and she would have said that she had no favorites in class, but that was a lie. Joey was that smelly kid in class. You know, disheveled, unkempt, grubby looking. And when he was asked a question in class, he would simply answer in one syllable. And sometimes she took some pleasure into writing a big red F on his tests and papers. One day she decided to look into the notes on other teachers from the lower grades and what they wrote about Joey. She said, the first grade teacher said he's a good boy, but he's got a rough home situation. Second grade teacher said he's a good boy, but his mom is terminally ill, and he seems deeply troubled. The third grade teacher said that he was very serious. His mother died over the summer, and his father doesn't seem very interested. And the fourth grade teacher, just before she gets Joey, the fourth grade teacher says this is a seriously troubled boy. So Christmas time comes in the fifth grade, and what do you do for Christmas in the fifth grade? Everybody comes and brings a present to the teacher, right? So all the kids brought their presents to Miss Thompson that day, and fancy wrapped presents with the big bows and nicely. And here comes Joey. Got an old brown paper bag kind of half wrapped around something and some masking tape that was hanging off. It was falling apart. Everybody starts laughing as he made his way up to the desk, right? This is when Miss Thompson did something that changed hers and Joey's life forever. She opened only his gift, and when she opened it, out plopped an old rhinestone bracelet with a couple of stones missing and a half a bottle of cheap perfume. She immediately put the bracelet on, took some of the perfume and dabbed it behind her ears and on her wrists. And at the end of the day, when everyone was on the way out the door, Joey walked up to her and said, "You know, Miss Thompson, you smell just like my mom, and her bracelet looks really good on you too." So the next day, Miss Thompson decided to be a teacher that was going to make a difference in the lives of her students. Years later, when Joey graduated from high school, he wrote her a note and said, "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm graduating second in my class. I just wanted you to know." 4 years later, when he graduated from college, he said, "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm graduating first, and I'm on my way to med school. I just wanted you to know." And then when he graduated from med school and he was getting married, he wrote her a note and said, "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm a doctor now, and I'm getting married, and I want you to come, and I'd like you to sit where my parents would sit if they were alive. My dad died this year, and you're the only family I have left." If you can't learn how to invest yourself in the life of others, maybe this story will come back to you. You know, this is a person who chose to care that day, and it was not an easy thing to do. That doctor is still a doctor in Buffalo. I actually looked him up after I heard the story, so it's a true story. So when I heard this at a conference, I said, well, this is what I have to do. I have to invest myself in other people's lives. I have to care enough to find the person who is that disheveled, that lonely, that person on the outs, and befriend them, accompany them. So within 3 years of my youth ministry job, I had a youth group that met every week of well over 250 kids, meeting every Wednesday night. When I used to do retreats, it would be 200 students, 200 kids. I used to bring 50 adults with me. We met at a Y camp because it was the only place that could hold us. It was a time in my life where I have to say was just an anointed time. I've never seen anything like that or had anything like that experience again. And after 3 years there, of course, my head got pretty big. And the Archdiocese asked if I would come and take a new position with them as the the director of English-speaking youth ministry for the Archdiocese of Miami, because they had a director of Spanish-speaking youth ministry who was a priest, Father Jose Luis Menendez, who he and I became fairly close. So I took the job, and I realized I missed the hands-on stuff. I lasted 2 years, and then I got a call asking if I would be the first director of the Catholic Student Center at the University of Miami. And I was excited about that. So here was another campus ministry. I'd never heard of campus ministry. I didn't know what campus ministry was. And I became the director of the Catholic Student Center in 1986. So again, because Al Gore hadn't yet invented the internet, I read the newly written Bishop's Pastoral Letter on Campus Ministry. It was written in 1985. It's called Empowered by the Spirit, Campus Ministry Faces the Future. I read it, and it was a wonderful experience. And when I got to the University of Miami, one of the very first things I had to do, and Paul, I don't even think you knew this, but I got the call from Jimmy Johnson. And he asked me to come and speak to the freshman football team, which I did. And it became an annual thing. As long as he was there, he would give me the theme, and I would come and I would speak to the freshman football team. His last year, the theme was try to convince this class to be the first class to go through 4 years at the University of Miami without anyone being indicted for a federal offense. True story. And by the way, they didn't make it, but but it was when I was at the University of Miami that I met Chris. We eventually married, and I think I credit her with being the person responsible for moving me to an adult faith. From Chris, I learned balance, and that my work was not my life. I learned to guard my time and set my priorities. And I was a slow learner. The day that I got married, my best man and I were sitting on the porch of my house, and he says to me, "You know, John, you can decide to either be a great campus minister or a great husband and father, but you can't be both." I just looked at him and smiled. I could do that. He was right. He was right. 6 months into my marriage, I decided I had to make a decision. And I decided to be a good husband and father. And that made all the difference. So his words were important to me. So throughout my time, I'm going to end pretty soon, all right? Throughout my time in campus ministry, a lot of firsts. I became the program director for a conference in 1988 that was being held in Miami. It was called Eastern Study Week. And that was when I first met Don Cousins, became a good friend. Found out then that Don Cousins actually wrote the Bishop's Pastoral Letter on campus ministry, he and Jim Basic. So two Ohio priests, campus ministers. Don was at Case Western at the time. Jim Basic was at the University of Toledo. They wrote the letter on campus ministry. Of course, it's nowhere in the document itself, but that's the way things go. And I learned more from him in the conversations we had since then, since 1988. I was on a team that put together the first professional certification of campus ministry. We met in 1992. And in 1993, I was part of the inaugural professionally certified campus ministers by the United States Bishop Conference. Now, things have changed. Every 7 years, I had to renew the certification. And that was not a problem until this last year. I had to renew in the fall. And this time, in order to renew my professional certification of something that I had been doing over 35 years, I had to prove that I was in a valid Catholic marriage. I had to prove that I was a Catholic in good standing. I had to have letters. And the second letter, the Catholic in good standing letter, had to come from my pastor, who was new pastor at my parish out in, well, I'm not going to tell you. As far as I'm concerned, he was a puppy, okay? He's just this young guy, and he is the one to vouch for my Catholicism, which I was a little bent out of shape about. So Father Tom wrote me a letter, which passed inspection. So I think the church has radically changed. I think campus ministry in the early days, to give you an idea, the nun who was in charge of the very first Catholic Campus Ministry National Conference in New Orleans. Great conference. I was on the program committee, loved it. She went home to her little Catholic school in New England, and she was fired shortly after. This conference was in January. She was fired in April because she decided that she was going to fill the holy water font with condoms. You're laughing, Nick. This was Holy Week, okay? And so she wanted to make a statement. Well, she made the statement, and then she was escorted off campus. The next national conference 2 years later was a Jesuit priest from St. Louis University and a nun. They co-chaired it. And from the conference, they ran away together. So you have two like prominent Catholic campus ministry folks, two nuns and a priest. And I mean, they're pretty far left of even me, okay, theologically. But you saw the campus ministry arm of the church being very far left, and an increasingly more and more vocal right arm of the church, or people that advocated for the more traditional conservative group. Campus ministry changed for me when the first student came up to me in 1999 and said, I'm confused. Was Vatican II good or bad? And I was stunned. And I realized that there were two very opposing positions. Was it good or bad? I had lived my life with the promise of Vatican II. To me, that was fresh air. It made the church approachable. And there was an increasingly larger number of Catholics in my purview that were saying it was the worst thing that happened to the church. So I believe that today, campus ministry is at a crossroads. Campus ministry, the national office itself, has really made a hard right turn. Ed, I think, as the program committee chair of our conference in 2013, you keynoted for us. And I was at that conference where Archbishop Chaput was also a keynote speaker. And someone from the audience said, Archbishop, what do you say to the priest shortage in the church? And immediately his response was, we don't have a priest shortage. We have enough we have enough priests for the faithful Catholics. And I thought, wrong answer, right? Wrong answer. I think that what has happened in our church and to our campus ministry is changing the way we work with students. 4 years later, 2017, I was asked to be on a program committee again for a national conference. And I asked Father Brian Massengale, who at that time was moving from Marquette over to Fordham. I asked him to be a keynote and to talk about racism. Okay, this was our committee. And so he had to be vetted through San Antonio, through the Archdiocese. Is he a Catholic good standing? Yes, everything went fine. And then the national office of CCMA decided that he was unacceptable. Even after the Archbishop in San Antonio said he was okay. But he was unacceptable because of his stand on LGBTQ. So they disbanded the committee and then reformed without me. And instead of racism, campus ministry talked about evangelism. So I believe with all my heart that as a campus minister, I am not called to be a catechist. I'm not called to be a sacramental dispensary. I'm not called to be even an evangelist. I think I'm called, and we are all called in campus ministry, to be missionaries to higher education. I think this is how we're going to make our mark. We meet the students where they are. We stretch them a little bit closer to the middle, to a place where they can talk to each other. We all got really, really good at standing on opposite ends of the room and throwing stones at each other. I think if campus ministry is going to survive, if the church is going to become relevant, we need to be at a place where we can hear each other, where we encounter each other. Pope Francis is always talking about this. He says we are to be in a constant state of mission, and we are to be in a place that encounters each other. Ignatian spirituality is right here. It's about accompaniment. It's about walking with someone as they're working things out. I'm not interested in just being a poster child, okay? I'm interested in entering into the life of young people. You know, my last story, and then I'll end. It's a movie called The Rookie by Dennis Quaid. Anybody see the movie? It's a great movie. Dennis Quaid, you know who Dennis Quaid is? He's got the smile that goes like here. It's huge. He's a 39-year-old guy, and he's a science teacher at a high school, and he had an accident and had to leave his baseball life, right? So 39 years old, he wants to make a comeback. And so he enters the baseball world, and he's taken on a minor league team, and he's traveling on a bus from little stadium to little stadium with 18 to 22-year-olds. I'm going to say that again. With 18 to 22-year-olds, okay? And he's the old guy on the bus. And he is having a really difficult time one night, feeling like he is just wasting his time. And so he calls home in a crisis, ready to leave, ready to come home. And he and his wife have this conversation that we're really not privy to. But he ends up changing his mind. The next day, he walks into his into locker room before the game, and he's all smiles. And he walks up to the team hot shot, and the hot shot says, "You know, what are you smiling about? What are you so happy about?" He goes, "You know what we get to do today? We get to play baseball." And when I think of that movie, and I think of my own life, I want to say, you know what I get to do today? I get to be a campus minister. I get to enter into the life of a young person and help them navigate their path and their way. And I do not regret a moment of my time. I've loved it, and I've been blessed by it and graced by it.